America, we stand for freedom. Though freedom is never really free, we yearn and strive for government protecting our liberty.
Good evening and welcome to Your Right to Know by the Fitchburg Republican City Committee. My name is Mary Lotze and I will be your host for this evening's show. Tonight I think we have a particularly timely topic because we have so many young people, our teenagers graduating from high school and going on to college, that we really look at, are our teenagers prepared? Are they scholastically prepared to go on to higher education? And tonight I have a panel of friends that happen to be college professors and instructors that we're going to talk about that very topic from their own experience in the scholastic setting. My first guest, of course, is a familiar face, very familiar face, Professor John Strang, who is a retired professor of ethics and logic, and he is also our chair of our Fitchburg Republican City Committee. Then I have my friend from Orange, Ray Younghans. Ray is the chair of the Orange Republican Town Committee and is also a retired instructor in the biological science. Welcome, both of you, my friends. I'm so happy you're here today to join us with this very important and certainly timely topic. As we get into looking at our students being prepared, what I'd like you just to sort of introduce our viewers to is how many years you've been in teaching, and give us just a minuscule background of your experience. John first.
Well, it's kind of difficult to calculate because I was a teacher as a graduate assistant also, but about 30 in all.
Okay.
I had a comment because I think one of the questions you earlier spoke about was your individual background and how you first entered into teaching. I did want to say something about that, if it's okay at this point.
Sure.
I actually got my first full-time teaching job as a philosophy teacher, filling in for a professor who had an emergency, and they needed a replacement on short notice. And the course in his case was already set up. He had selected the book and the format of the course, so I had no control over it. And it was an eye-opener to me in the sense that he had established that his students would do essays to measure their understanding of the material. And I was shocked to discover that the great bulk of the students in this class were indeed submitting essays, but they hadn't written the essays.
Oh.
They had taken these essays.
This was 30 years ago.
This was right at the very beginning. They'd taken the essays evidently off websites or some other extraneous source, and this was obvious from the language they used, the terms they used. They didn't normally speak this way. They didn't normally use these terms, and you could test and confirm indeed that they were they were plagiarizing or worse, by asking them to follow up on something, to elaborate on something they allegedly had written in their essay, and of course they were at a complete loss to do so. So it was a shock to me, that discovery, and I determined it made an impact on the way I taught subsequently. I determined I would never assign an essay to a student until I knew the student.
Sure.
And so in all of my introductory courses, I would require quizzes and examinations in lieu of essays. So.
Ray, how about you?
Well, I'm kind of varied with my occupations. After I graduated from college, I opened a restaurant.
Sure, you were a private business owner.
And even then, I used to have talking sessions with the students that were working for me, and I found that what's going on here? They don't know the basics. And I had my business for 18 years. And after that closed, I went to grad school at Fitchburg State. And while I was at grad school, I had multiple jobs, and I tutored at Fitchburg State, and I tutored at Mount Wachusett Community College. And there I found students coming in lacking the basics of education in both math and science. Imagine helping a girl out at the college level with fractions, and she would pick up the drill of it. Then say we go off on a break for Christmas, she'd come back and we have to start from the same point. And I found this with a lot of the students, that they were what they should have learned in high school, they were doing in college, and they were doing remedial courses before they could actually advance into the required courses.
So I think both of you are really saying that what you found when you got to the college level as a teacher, instructor, professor, is that the children were really, now I shouldn't use the term children, they're young adults, were coming in very ill-prepared in the basics. When do you think, in your case over 30 years, and less in yours, although you had such completely diverse educational endeavors, you were in the biological sciences, you were more in the applied sciences or theoretical philosophy.
Right.
When did you see it diminish then over your years of teaching? So you actually came in where you thought the baseline was lacking. Have you seen it even decrease in your years of teaching since that time?
I certainly concur with Ray that the central problem, as I see it, is the lack of basics. High schools no longer prepare students with basics.
Could you explain to our
Well,
listeners
reading and writing.
the
Reading and writing
basics?
in the case of, what I would expect from my students, in the case of your students, basic mathematical skills, I'm sure. These were skills that you could have assumed were taught in college 40, 50 years ago. And
You mean taught in high school?
I mean in high school, 40 or 50 years ago, and now they had to be taught in college for the very reasons that Ray set forth. And this is indeed the level of teaching in college. It's a waste of a professor's time to have to go over these basics. But it isn't even complete there. You asked the question: Have these situations gotten worse in our teaching careers? Yes, although I think since I've retired, it's gotten still worse. Now, indeed, maybe later at a point I could go into that, but I think now professors have to deal with levels of issues and certain issues they have to avoid because of concerns of political correctness that were not nearly as bad as that when I was a teacher.
Ray, what about your experience in terms of your students coming in? Did you notice a difference in the years that you were an instructor in sciences?
I noticed a big difference, especially in attitude.
Okay, that goes more into what John was saying.
When, I'm dating myself, but when I went to college in the 1960s, courses like anatomy, you lived, and you didn't look at a time clock. Well, I put my 3 hours in, that's it. You spent extra hours and you got to the point where you knew what you were talking about. And you could understand the concept of human anatomy and physiology.
You studied until you learned it.
Right. In teaching anatomy labs, I found that students are saying, well, I'm doing my 3 hours of lab, that's it. The majority of them were like that. You would find exceptional people that said, hey, I've got to do more for my own benefit, that I've got to live this course. I was teaching a college course in anatomy lab, and I was also doing another course across the hall from this lab. And I let the students know, I'm here on Mondays, and I'm right across the hall. Feel free to come in and use the lab. Not once did a student come in and ask to use that lab.
Why do you think, in reflection, why do you think young people are more unprepared now for higher level? I mean, we have a lot of possible options, one being competitive. The competitive spirit of doing better and excelling may or may not be there any longer. We there's a lack of deeper instruction maybe offered at the high school level. People aren't trained to think critically. What's your opinions of why we're not seeing a better trained younger people coming into college?
I think that part of the problem is something that happened to the educational establishment probably beginning in the 1960s. And by educational establishment, I mean primarily the high school level teachers. Instead of focusing on basics, making sure that students who were going to get a degree, a diploma, had satisfied requirements in basics in English, writing, being able to communicate, express themselves, basics in mathematics, there was a branching out into other areas which might be amusing, but they didn't really satisfy the need for qualifying in the basics. Students, it was also in this period that you had an increase in the variety of topics that students could choose to take in high schools. Fewer courses were actually required. When I was in high school, you had to satisfy, for example, 4 years of English, 4 years of composition were part of that, 4 years in the math, 4 years in the science, 4 years in a foreign language. None of this apparently is now the case. And 4 years in gymnastics, which is also important. Now it's not even required to have physical exercise. One consequence is we see young people who are grossly overweight for their age. I mean, it's just outrageous. But you cannot assume that young people who enter college will come in having read much. They tend to be unread. You cannot assume that they can articulate their positions. They are inarticulate. You cannot assume that they think about much. They're unpensive. That's different from when I went to college. And I wasn't that exceptional. I'm not a brilliant human being. I was a hard worker. And that was true, I think, of many of the young men and women of my era. I think a major problem has been that high schools don't teach basics. That's, from my opinion, that's the basic issue. That's the one issue which explains everything else. I wouldn't expect a high school student, for example, to be particularly adept in critical thinking, but I would expect him or her to have the tools that would allow that to be developed as they go on to college.
Do you see that, Ray, when we talk about students not having a depth of critical thinking? You do a lot online. You're very familiar with being online. Do you think a lot of that is especially in today's day and age, that so many young people get their news, their information, they're really almost like education. Every hour that's not spent physically in a classroom is not spent seeking out further education. Like you said, they didn't use a lab that you made available to them with you as a helpmate or a tutor to help them through if they were having trouble. But they spend time online just looking up silly stuff, hobbies, what the Kardashians are doing, gossip items.
The problem here too is their ability to separate correctness. That when something comes on the internet, regardless of what it is, hey, this is correct. I'm not going to judge. I'm not going to think, is this right? But well, it's stated here, therefore it's
gospel.
It's gospel. And one thing that I think that we find with high school students these days is the attitude that they're projecting is they're learning from their liberal high school administrators and teachers that if you're having a hard time, don't worry about it, we'll pass you.
That's that lack of competition that's fostered.
And if you're failing a subject, we'll give you extra credit work. Why should we give them extra credit work when they can't master the basics? By giving them something specialized to do that involves, again, deeper thinking, they can't project themselves into this. But again, they'll cut and paste off the internet.
Right. This is something I found in my classes. In my courses, like my intro philosophy course, I would stipulate at the beginning a syllabus what was expected of them. I had 4 exams. Each exam counted 25% of the grade, pretty straightforward. routinely I would encounter students who didn't do well in the first exam, got demoralized, didn't show up for the second exam. They'd already lost 50% of their coursework, and they would come to me, can I do extra credit? And I tell them, no, you can't do extra credit. You know, extra credit, the whole concept of extra credit, I never have agreed with. I think that it's an insult to students who actually do their job. Why should an individual student be given an opportunity to do something extra because he or she didn't do what was required?
What was required?
It's just it's nonsense. So I guess I got a reputation as a hard teacher, but this is something they should have gotten in high school. They shouldn't arrive in college having had this leniency ingrained into their mentality, where they expect, well, somehow I can make up for it if I don't do what's required. But it's rampant.
Ray,
It's rampant.
you have a couple examples of being classified or considered a hard teacher, and your sciences, your educational endeavor actually would allow students or prepare students to be medical personnel. Could you explain some of the fallout that you would frequently get?
Some of the horror stories that I've had is where I had a girl who left lab an hour before the end of the time period, and I would actually go out in the hall and say, "Where are you going?" And this girl earned a C, and I gave her a C. She needed a C plus to get into nursing, but I gave her a C.
Nursing school.
Nursing school, but I gave her a C. She appealed to a dean, and the dean on 2 or 3 occasions called me up wanting to up the grade. And I would say to her, you can see that I was in a very bad accident. And where I was at a rehab hospital, and I met one of my high school friends there who had fallen about 12 inches off a low bar and broke his neck. He was paralyzed from the neck down. And this man was a genius. But he was a captive in his own body. And he swore that his paralysis was not caused by the fall on the low bar, but on the care and treatment he received in a New Jersey hospital.
Sure, so we have a direct correlation between someone they wanted you to promote artificially that wasn't meeting standards, that would then potentially go on and be a direct caregiver.
And with their attitude of not really caring, people can get hurt. And it's a very subtle hurt because nobody will go back and look at how was he treated, how was she treated. Like my friend was constantly taken in and out of traction, where a standard traction for, say, 2 weeks might have alleviated the situation, but he was put in and out of traction by the hospital personnel. This further added to his injury.
Do you see, today everything is computers and everything is computerized learning, but one of the things that I personally feel, and this is only an observation, is that we have very few people who can connect the dots of an argument or connect the dots. Everything seems to be sort of stovepipe facts. If you asked a student how a fact relates to other issues, they couldn't tell you how that happens, because what we learn on computer is really non-dimensional. It's strictly facts. And yet science and philosophy can be factually based, but do you find that people aren't connecting dots and seeing a whole picture?
Certainly.
In education?
Certainly. Unfortunately, computers, for all the wonderful things that they do, they give us access, almost instant access to needed information. People who enter into a computer culture, and we're certainly in a computer culture, don't enter in with a critical mentality of a philosopher. computer technology is an outgrowth of one aspect of philosophy. The whole language was is a derivative from Wittgenstein, the philosopher. But they would have had a different attitude to computers. It's a tool, above all. Techne, the Greek basis for technology, means tool-based, okay? And this is not the way in which young people, and older people increasingly, approach it. They, as you said, the isolated facts and data you can derive by typing in something on a computer keyboard doesn't give you an overall grasp of how this relates. And you're not going to get that from a detached mechanism like that. Arguably, and this is a philosophical point that we couldn't go into in detail here, but arguably this is going to result in a culture which is increasingly isolated and is able to draw up facts but doesn't see the interrelation of these facts. And beyond this, doesn't see the basis of concepts like objectivity and so on, the elements that go into thinking. They will not be substantiated in a computer-oriented culture. We already find this reflected in the kind of people we have in our world. Their psyches, as it were, are increasingly broken up, and they are not whole beings. They're not whole human beings. This is going to be particularly frightful in coming generation when we have increasingly human-like robots, artificial intelligence as embodied in what are apparently human forms, where human beings will be in a position of not being able to evaluate, well, how do they differ from me? How do I evaluate, how do I establish my own worth in relation to...
And the evaluation piece comes into the critical thinking, being
Right.
able to evaluate the
Right.
pro and the con.
Right.
Where do you think we need to go? I mean, as long-term instructors, professors, working with students, where do we need to change?
Well, I think we have to admit that there is a basic problem going on in our educational system, and it's not going to be solved by more money. Because more money simply will increase the problems we have now. The educational establishment at the high school level is not solving the problem because they're not focusing on basics. At the college level, as Ray alluded to earlier, there's an ideological consideration here because overwhelmingly colleges and universities are dominated by people of a progressive mentality. And they encourage the very problems that we're seeing right now. For example, Ray alluded to, or maybe you did, the fact that excuses are made. People are passed on without really proving their qualifications. We find this rampant around us. Here's just one passage I happen to draw up on a blog where the writer says this: thanks to progressive educational theories, year after year of banalities, students are passed without never getting a red mark on anything they submit. What happens when they get to college? They have to go through writing courses where professors, usually a harried adjunct, are supposed to brush up their long neglected grammar. It's too little, too late, but only one course is offered and they can never do it. So you wind up churning out people who don't have the qualifications. And beyond this, you find increasingly the demands coming from college students, particularly in heavily progressive colleges, where they be passed whether they make the grade or not.
Right.
Like Oberlin College, for example, a prominent liberal arts college in Ohio, students recently demanded that midterms be abolished, that no grades be accorded less than a C, and that they be given adequate time to be activists.
So
in various progressive causes. So there are levels of incompetence which have become ingrained. Another site, I don't want to take this all up, but a school system in Charlotte, North Carolina is eliminating the role of the valedictorian because they don't want to embarrass students.
Sure, again, taking away that competition.
They don't want competition, and
academic
competition, of course, historically is the basis of education.
Ray, in your field, where do you think, in the science, where do you think, where's the future? What do we need to change?
One of the things that I look at and immediately I'm branded a racist is that I think affirmative action has outlived itself. Back in the 1960s, 1970s, where we had segregation in schools, affirmative action was needed. It was needed to bring up people that had been denied a proper education. But 50 years have gone by, and the communities have mixed, the communities have integrated, but these people are still relying on affirmative action to bring up their grades.
I have just 1 minute left to talk, but what about Common Core? I know it's going to be on the ballot in November. Stop Common Core or support Common Core. People want Common Core integrated into the primary school and the junior high and high school level. Do you think Common Core integrated into the school system will help this problem with the basics, or will it injure the students further and make them more ill-prepared?
I think I'll let Ray direct himself to that.
I think that with the introduction of Common Core, it's going to demean the learning experience even further. Because what we'll be doing is bring our education system down further to compensate for the lack of effectiveness of teaching. When we take a look at Holyoke school system, or Chicopee, where we have a high Hispanic population, and we have a 37% English equivalency that they speak Spanish. Mm-hmm. And we have generations of speaking Spanish. These people have not integrated into our community for the whole part, but they have remained separate, and they brought their language with them. Imagine a high school where only 37% of the students can comprehend English fluently. Mm-hmm. And we're finding this just not in Chicopee or Holyoke, but we're finding this all over.
All the large cities. I have to end it there. I want to thank you both. This is always the fastest half hour on TV, certainly when we get into a deep topic. And I know we could have gone on for hours. So thank you, John, and thank you, Ray, for coming and joining us tonight. This is a especially critical topic at this time of year especially, but now also looking at Common Core, which may or may not reach its goal. I have a lot of questions about Common Core. And for our viewers, we thank you for watching Your Right to Know and sitting in tonight with the Fitchburg Republican City Committee. As we leave you, we want you to know and remember that your local city or town Republican Committee is the only grassroots organization that supports and holds dear your liberty and your constitutional rights and conservative values. We encourage you to join us. Why? Because to us, the GOP stands for growth, opportunity, and prosperity, and because we always stand for freedom. Thank you and good night.
America, we stand for freedom. So let us all unite to yearn and strive for our republic that reflects our values, that preserves our rights, and goes forth in power and might, that reflects our values and preserves our rights, and goes forth in power and might.